Go to the credit union on Robson Street, the retired colonel said, standing at the edge of my father's grave in the November rain. Tell them your father's name. Show them this. He pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand before I could say a single word, then turned and walked away through the rows of white crosses at the Field of Honor in Point Claire. There were maybe 12 people at the burial. A few of my father's old friends from the Legion Hall in Verdun. My neighbor who'd driven me there because I didn't trust myself behind the wheel. My aunt who'd flown in from Sudbury and kept touching my arm in a way that was meant to be comforting but wasn't. And then that man. Tall, straight-backed, silver-haired, wearing a dark overcoat with nothing on it to indicate his rank. I only knew what he was because my father's friend leaned over and whispered it to me afterward. My father had been a JTF2 operator. That's what the death notice said, in the careful language reserved for men who did things the government preferred not to describe in detail. Joint Task Force 2, Canada's Special Operations Unit. He'd served for nearly 2 decades before a degenerative hip condition forced him into early retirement. After that, he'd lived quietly in a rented duplex in the Plateau Mont-Royal neighborhood of Montreal. He worked part-time at a hardware store on Saint Laurent. He went to Mass on Sundays when he felt like it. He called me every Thursday at 7 in the evening, always at 7, and we talked about nothing in particular. The weather, my job at the credit risk firm, whether the Canadiens were going to have a decent season. He never talked about what he'd done in service. Not once. He died of a sudden cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in October. His downstairs neighbor heard something fall and knocked on the door for 2 days before calling the building super, who called the paramedics, who called me. I was sitting in a meeting about quarterly compliance reports when my phone buzzed with a Quebec area code I didn't recognize. I excused myself and took the call in the hallway. The paramedic's voice was careful and kind, and I understood almost none of what she said. I stood there with my hand pressed flat against the wall for a very long time. My brother, Colin, called me that evening. He lives in Calgary now, has for almost 8 years. We were close when we were young and less so after he left. He's not a bad person, he's just someone who measures things. So what does he actually have? He asked, maybe 20 minutes into the call. I was still sitting in my father's driveway, in the car, not ready to go inside. I haven't looked at anything yet, I said. He was buried today. Right, yeah, of course. A pause. I just mean, when you get a chance. There was something in the tone, not grief exactly, more like calculation dressed up as concern. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my father's kitchen and drank tea I didn't want, and looked at his things. The mug he used every morning, his reading glasses folded on top of the crossword he'd never finish, his work boots by the back door, still faintly muddy from the last time he'd worn them. Everything in the house was modest and practical and clean. He'd never owned property. He drove a 2009 Civic with 200,000 kilometers on it. His clothing was functional. His furniture was from IKEA and a few places on Amherst Street. Nothing about this house suggested anything hidden. The piece of paper the colonel had given me was still in my coat pocket. I unfolded it at the kitchen table. It had a name on it, Coastal Heritage Credit Union, Robson Street, Vancouver, and a date handwritten in pen, next week's date. Beneath that, a single sentence, he arranged everything. They're expecting someone. I looked at that paper for a long time. Colin texted the next morning. Any news on the estate? I put my phone face down on the table and didn't answer. My father's will was straightforward on the surface. It had been prepared by a notary in Westmount and filed properly. The duplex obviously wasn't his, it went back to the landlord. His car came to me. His RRSP, what remained of it, was modest. His personal belongings, that was what the will listed. That was all the will listed. But that afternoon, while I was going through the hall closet looking for his winter coat to donate, I found a locked metal box on the top shelf, behind a stack of old Canadian Geographic issues. I didn't have the key. I set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. Then I went looking through his desk drawer and found a small envelope taped to the back of the bottom drawer, the kind of place you'd only find if you were looking carefully or if someone had told you to look. Inside was a key and a folded index card. The index card said, "For you, not Colin." You'll understand why. That sentence sat in my chest like a stone. I called the credit union the next morning. The woman who answered was polite and measured, her English precise. "May I have the account holder's name?" she asked. I gave her my father's name, a pause. Longer than a standard pause. Yes, she said. We've been expecting a call. Are you able to come in person? I told her I'd need a few days to arrange travel. Of course. Please bring government-issued ID and a copy of the death certificate. We'll take care of the rest. She didn't mention money. She didn't mention accounts. She said we'll take care of the rest in the same tone a GP uses when they've already made a referral and just need you to show up. I went back through the house with different eyes that afternoon. The locked box I couldn't open yet. A filing cabinet in the second bedroom that I'd assumed was empty. It wasn't. It was locked, too. A small safe built into the back of the bedroom closet, behind a false panel. You'd never see it unless you knew it was there. My father had not lived carelessly. He had lived deliberately. Colin called again that evening. Did you talk to the notary? He asked. I have an appointment, I said. There's some paperwork. What kind of paperwork? Is there property somewhere? Because if there's property, Colin. I stopped him. It's been 4 days. A long exhale on his end. I know. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure things are handled right. I'll handle them right. After I hung up, I booked a flight to Vancouver. I didn't tell him. I told him I needed a few days to deal with some estate logistics, that a trip west might be involved. That was true enough to hold him for a while. He's in sales. He knows when someone is managing him, and he usually lets it go if he thinks the outcome will still favor him. I think he calculated that I wouldn't cut him out entirely. He was right mostly, though not in the way he expected. The morning before my flight, he drove up from Lethbridge without calling first. He just arrived. His rental car was in the driveway when I came downstairs at 7. He was standing in the living room when I let him in, looking around the same way he'd looked around the last time he'd visited, years ago, like he was doing an appraisal. The house looked smaller to him, I could tell. All these modest things. He seemed almost disappointed. I just thought I'd help, he said. Help with what? Going through everything, making decisions. There's not much to go through, I said. He picked up a framed photograph from the bookshelf. Dad and me at the Ottawa Tulip Festival, maybe 12 years ago. He set it back down. He never really opened up to me, Colin said. After I moved, we talked, but it was always surface stuff. He was like that with everyone, I said, not with you. I didn't have an answer for that, because he wasn't entirely wrong. I had stayed. I'd visited most Sundays when I lived in Montreal. After I moved to Toronto for work, I came back when I could, and we talked every Thursday. He told me small things over the years, preferences, opinions, the occasional story about a fishing trip in his 20s, never about service, but enough that I knew the shape of who he was. He loved you, I said. Colin put his hands in his coat pockets. He respected you. That's different. That sentence went somewhere deep and stayed there. I packed a single carry-on that afternoon. My passport, my ID, a copy of the death certificate, and the key from the envelope. I didn't take my father's passport. I hadn't found one, but later, going through the locked box after I finally found the right key and a 10 on his workbench, I found something I hadn't expected. A stack of boarding passes going back almost 15 years. Vancouver, again and again. Once a year, sometimes twice. Always in October or March. He'd never mentioned a single one of these trips. The flight from Toronto to Vancouver is about 5 hours. I had a window seat and I stared at the country we were crossing, and I thought about how little of someone you can know even when you think you know them well. My father had gone to Vancouver quietly, year after year, and I had no idea. When I was visiting him on Sundays, he'd been flying west at least once a year, and he'd never said a word. That's the thing about certain kinds of people. They don't lie. They just live in compartments, and they decide, carefully, which ones to share. Vancouver was cold and clean when I landed. The kind of cold that's different from Montreal. Cold, wetter, greener, softer. I took a cab to the hotel on Granville, checked in, and spent the evening reading everything in the locked box. Old letters. A photograph of my father with 3 other men, none of them in uniform, standing in front of something that looked like a community center, or maybe a youth shelter. A handwritten list of names, first names only, and beside each one, an amount and a date. The amounts ranged from $2,000 to $25,000. The dates went back 11 years. I couldn't sleep. The credit union was on Robson Street, as the paper had said. Understated from the outside, no grand entrance. The kind of financial institution that doesn't need to advertise because its members already know where it is. Inside, everything was quiet and well-ordered. Wooden paneling. Natural light. The receptionist called someone the moment I gave my father's name. A woman named Diane came out to meet me. Mid-50s, calm, the kind of capable that doesn't announce itself. "I'm very sorry for your loss," she said, guiding me to a private meeting room. "Your father was a man of great consistency." That word, consistency. I'd heard something similar from his old Legion friends. Never greatness, never achievement. Always steadiness, consistency, reliability. "You knew him?" I asked. "In a professional capacity," she said. "He came in every October, sometimes March, if there was something to review." She opened a folder. Inside were documents going back to 2009. My father's signature on the first page of each one. "He established a foundation here in 2009, she said, registered under federal charitable status. It has been maintained with consistent annual contributions and managed under a conservative investment mandate." She turned the folder toward me. The numbers were not what I expected. I stared at them for a long time. "This can't be right," I said, "the way you say it when you know it probably is." "It is correct," she said. "The foundation currently holds approximately $4.3 million in assets." My father had lived in a rented duplex. He drove a 20-year-old Civic. He'd worked part-time at a hardware store and eaten his lunches at home. "What was it for?" I asked. Diane folded her hands. "The foundation was established to support a specific group of individuals, veterans and their families who had fallen through the gaps, operational stress injuries that weren't covered, kids of former operators who needed support for education or housing, widows whose spouses hadn't served long enough for full pension benefits." I sat back slowly. "He never said anything," I said. "He was very clear that he didn't want recognition," she said. "Confidentiality was a condition he built into the structure from the beginning." "And me? You are named as the successor director. Upon his death, oversight transfers to you." She paused. "The foundation cannot be dissolved without a full board review. He built in safeguards." I thought of Colin immediately, his voice on the phone. "Is there property somewhere? Are there other beneficiaries?" I asked. "Other family?" "The foundation has a list of supported individuals and families," she said. "None of them are aware of your father's passing yet. We were waiting for you." She slid another envelope across the table. "He left a letter," she said quietly, "to be delivered only after his death. He was very specific about that." My hands were steadier than I expected as I picked it up. My phone buzzed. "Colin." I let it ring through, then answered when it buzzed again. "Hey," he said, before I could speak. "Just checking in. Any news on the estate stuff?" "Still going through paperwork," I said. I wasn't lying. "Is there anything significant? Like amounts?" I looked at the folder in front of me, the letter in my other hand. "There's something," I said carefully. "I need time to understand what I'm looking at." A long pause on his end. "How much time?" I didn't answer, because in that moment I understood something clearly. This wasn't a windfall waiting to be divided. This was a set of responsibilities my father had spent 15 years building in silence, and my brother had absolutely no idea what our father had actually been doing all along. I didn't tell Colin the number. I told him the estate was more complex than expected, and that I needed a few more days. That was true. The meeting room was quiet after I hung up. Diane had excused herself to let me read the letter alone. My father's handwriting was the same as it had always been. Small, even block letters, the way he wrote everything. Grocery lists and birthday cards and the occasional note he'd leave on the kitchen table when I'd stayed over. He'd never been a person who used a lot of words. The letter was the same. If you're reading this, I ran out of time before I could explain it in person. I want you to know I thought about telling you more than once. I didn't because I watched what happened when Daniel Moreau's family found out about his insurance settlement, and I didn't want that to be us. Money changes what people hear. I had to set the letter down for a moment. He went on to explain what the foundation was. He wrote about the men he'd served with, some of whom he'd stayed in contact with long after they'd all left service. The ones who came back with injuries that didn't show up on any medical scan. The ones whose marriages broke under weight that wasn't visible from the outside. The ones who needed a bridge, not charity, he wrote. A bridge between where they were and where they could get to. He'd started setting money aside in his first year out of service, small amounts at first. Then more disciplined contributions as he figured out what he was building. "You don't make a noise about helping people," he wrote, "you just help them." Diane returned with another folder, anonymized summaries of 15 years of foundation activity. A daughter's first year at UBC covered after her father's suicide left the family without income. A mortgage in Fredericton quietly brought current so a family didn't lose their home. A man in Kelowna who needed specialized PTSD treatment that provincial coverage didn't include. 12 recipients over 15 years, not large numbers, just steady ones. My father had clipped coupons. He'd bought his shirts at Mark's work warehouse. He'd eaten rice and beans twice a week because, he said, it was cheap and he liked it. He had declined, according to Diane, several opportunities over the years to draw from the foundation for personal purposes. He hadn't taken a single dollar for himself. "What happens now?" I asked. "You assume the directorship," Diane said. "Distributions continue unless you choose otherwise. You'll work with the board. There are 2 other members, both named in the foundation documents, to make decisions going forward." "Can I dissolve it?" "It's within your legal authority," she said evenly. "There would be tax and regulatory implications, and the board would need to concur." I thought about Colin, about the tone of his phone calls, about the way he'd stood in my father's living room doing arithmetic in his head. I thought about what dissolution would mean. The money would go somewhere, eventually, after the legal and tax process worked itself out. It wouldn't go to veterans' families. It would go to me and Colin and the government's share. It would pay off Colin's line of credit, and maybe let me buy a place downtown, and that would be the end of 15 years of careful, quiet work. "My brother will challenge this," I said. I didn't phrase it as a question. Diane nodded slightly. "Family disputes and estate matters are not unusual. The foundation is registered and compliant under federal law. The documentation is thorough." She slid a packet across the table. "Contact information for a Vancouver firm that specialized in charitable foundation governance and estate disputes. This will not be dramatic," she said. "It will be administrative." That was almost comforting. Outside the credit union, the November air smelled like the ocean, faint but present. I walked along the seawall for a while before going back to the hotel. The mountains were visible across the water, gray and steady in the clouds. I didn't feel wealthy. I felt like I'd been handed something I hadn't earned and would have to prove I deserved. That evening, Colin called 4 times before I answered. "Don't dodge me," he said when I picked up. "I'm not dodging you. I'm processing." "What is there to process?" "Just tell me what he had." I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and told him about the foundation. Not all of it at once. I walked him through it the way Diane had walked me through it, carefully, in order. "He had $4 million, Colin said, very quietly, when I got to that part. "In a registered charitable foundation, yes." Silence. "And it goes to veterans' families, and their kids, and some housing support, yes." Another silence, longer. "And us?" "I'm the director," I said. "That's what he designated." "So what do I get?" I looked at the letter on the bed beside me. "Money changes what people hear." "You're not named as a beneficiary," I said. The silence after that was a different kind of silence. So he cut me out. He made a decision. Because I left. Colin's voice had gone flat. Because I moved and built a life somewhere else. Because I wasn't the perfect, dutiful daughter who stayed close and visited every Sunday. That's not what this is. Then what is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like $4 million, and my name isn't on any of it. "He wrote about you," I said quietly. "What did he write?" I hesitated. "He said he'd already given you what he could in the way he was able to." A short, humorless sound. "What does that mean?" It meant the recipe he'd set up when Colin was 12 that had paid for 3 years of his business degree. The emergency loan in 2017 when Colin's startup collapsed, the co-signing of Colin's first car loan, which Colin had defaulted on and my father had quietly covered. Colin knew about all of these things. He'd just reframed them over the years as small paternal obligations rather than deliberate investment. "He helped you," I said, "more than once. Those were loans. He never asked you to repay them." "That's not the same as this." "No," I said. "It isn't." Colin said he was calling a lawyer. I told him I expected that. We hung up without either of us saying goodbye properly, which had been the shape of a lot of our conversations in recent years. I reread the letter twice more before I turned off the light. Trust isn't the same as love, my father had written near the end. I love both of you. I trusted you with this because I watched you choose steadiness when it was harder. That's all. I didn't sleep well. But I didn't feel like I'd done anything wrong either. The lawyer Colin hired was an estate litigator in Calgary who sent a formal demand letter to the foundation's registered address within 2 weeks at my return from Vancouver. He claimed the foundation had not been properly disclosed in the probate process, that its assets should form part of the distributable estate, and that as a direct heir, Colin was entitled to an equal share. Thomas Okafor, the foundation's legal counsel in Vancouver, 60-something, meticulous, the kind of person who speaks in complete sentences even in informal settings, reviewed the letter and called me the same afternoon. "This is a standard probe," he said. "They're checking the structure?" "Will it hold?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Your father was thorough. The foundation was registered under the Canada Revenue Agency, had filed annual T301010 returns for 15 years, was compliant in every respect, and had been referenced briefly but correctly in the notarized will. There was no concealment. There was nothing to contest on the merits." Colin's lawyer knew this. He was making noise to see if I'd negotiate. The CRA correspondence took several months to work through. No court appearance, no dramatic hearing, just letters and documentation, and Thomas's calm, methodical responses. I kept working. I kept doing my job at the credit risk firm. I continued the foundation's scheduled distributions. 2 families received support during that period that had nothing to do with my family dispute, and I found a strange steadiness in that. One day, at a mediator session, Colin's lawyer had requested the retired colonel appeared. He'd been listed as a founding witness to the original registration documents and was willing to provide a statement. He didn't say much. He confirmed he'd known my father since their service overlap in the late 90s. He confirmed he'd been aware of my father's intention to establish long-term support for operational veterans. He confirmed that no one had pressured or influenced my father's decisions. Colin's lawyer tried to suggest the colonel had unduly influenced the foundation's structure. "He didn't take advice from me on this," the colonel said evenly. "He gave it." The mediator's written finding came 3 weeks later. The foundation was valid. Colin's claim was dismissed. Outside the mediator's office in downtown Toronto, Colin and I stood on the sidewalk in the cold. He looked tired in a way that wasn't about the case. "You were never going to move," he said. "No. Even when I said I'd walk away if you didn't split it. Even then." He looked at the street. A streetcar went by, grinding along King. "He really built all that," he said. "Not a question." "Yeah, $4 million. And he drove that rusted Civic." "He liked the Civic," I said. "He said it was reliable." Colin made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. We stood there a while in the cold, not quite ready to leave. "I felt like he was disappointed in me," Colin said. "For leaving. For the startup thing. For all of it." "I don't think he was disappointed," I said. "I think he just knew what I could carry." Colin looked at me. "And what about what I can carry?" That was the question I'd been waiting for him to ask. I told him about the provision. The foundation's governance documents included a clause, my father had included it deliberately, for direct family stabilization grants, available at the director's discretion, subject to conditions. Structured debt repayment support, financial counseling covered by the foundation, conditional annual disbursements tied to documented progress. Colin was quiet for a long time. "You put conditions on it," he said. "Dad put the conditions on it," I said. "I'm just honoring them. So I'd have to report to you. To an advisor. Not to me." He looked at the street again. "That's humiliating." "It's a bridge," I said, his word. Another long silence. "Is that what you actually think I need?" he asked. "I think it's what he thought you needed," I said. And I think he was probably right. Colin didn't answer right away. He buttoned his coat against the cold. "I'll think about it," he said finally. That was the most honest thing he'd said in months. He drove back to Calgary that weekend. We texted a few times in the weeks after. Careful, brief messages, the kind that are checking without admitting they're checking. He called his bank. He called the financial advisor I'd recommended. He called me one Thursday evening just to talk, and we spoke for 40 minutes about nothing very important, the way we used to when we were younger, before he left and distance became the main thing between us. He agreed to the structured arrangement 4 months after the mediation. Not enthusiastically, but genuinely. A year after my father's burial, I drove out to the field of honor on a Sunday in November. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. The headstone was simple. His name, his rank, his dates. He hadn't wanted anything decorative. He'd been very clear about that in his instructions. Brief instructions, 2 sentences, filed with the notary alongside the will. I stood there for a while in the cold. The grass was still green the way Quebec grass stays green into late fall, stubborn and particular. I thought about the photograph I'd found in the locked box. My father with those 3 other men, none of them in uniform, standing in front of what turned out to be a transition house for veterans in the downtown east side of Vancouver. Diane had confirmed it. He'd helped fund its operating costs for 7 years. He'd never told anyone. He'd been there once a year to see that the money was being used properly. The colonel had told me that in our one phone call after everything was settled. He went every October, he said. He never stayed long. He just needed to see it with his own eyes. I thought about a line from the letter I'd read so many times I had it memorized now. You don't make a noise about helping people. You just help them. The noise is for you. The help is for them. My father had never needed the noise. I still work at the credit risk firm. I do the foundation's administrative work in the evenings and on weekends. It is not glamorous. It's spreadsheets and board calls and CRA filings and careful conversations with people and difficult circumstances. But there is something in it that steadies me. Something that feels, when I'm honest with myself, like following a path someone laid down quietly in advance and trusted me to find. Colin sends his updates every month on the 15th. They're brief and factual, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he includes something extra. A small observation about his finances, a note about something he's reconsidered. Last month he wrote, "I think I finally understand what he meant about bridges." I didn't respond right away. I saved that message and read it again a few days later, and then I wrote back, "Yeah, me too." The foundation continues, the distributions go out on schedule. A young woman in Halifax started her nursing degree in September, tuition covered by a grant that had nothing to do with her own connections or family wealth, and everything to do with the fact that her father had served quietly and been broken quietly and died before anyone had the right words. She doesn't know where the money comes from. That's how it's supposed to work. My father was a JTF2 operator. He lived in a rented duplex, drove a Civic, and ate rice and beans twice a week. He died without telling anyone what he'd been building for 15 years in Vancouver, once a year, in October. He didn't leave quietly. He left instructions, and he trusted me enough to know I'd follow them. I keep coming back to one image. My father at a hardware store in St. Laurent, cutting rope for someone, smelling like sawdust and machine oil, going home to his rented duplex and his rice and beans and his crossword. And then, once a year in October, quietly boarding a flight to Vancouver to check on money he'd given away. He never told anyone. He never needed to. I used to think that kind of silence was just his personality, something closed in him, something withheld. It took going through his locked box, reading his boarding passes, sitting across from Diane in that quiet credit union on Robson Street to understand that the silence wasn't absence. It was a choice he made every single day because he understood something I had to learn the hard way. What you do when no one is watching is the only version of yourself that actually counts. Colin spent years measuring what he was owed. I understand that impulse now better than I did during the mediation, when I was still defensive about it. He'd moved away, built something, watched it fail, and quietly tallied what he'd lost against what our father hadn't given him. The resentment made sense. It just wasn't accurate. Because our father had given him things, real things, money and cosigns and patience. He'd just given them without ceremony, and Colin had filed them under obligation rather than care. That's what resentment does. It reframes everything that came before, so the ledger always reads in your favor. What I've come to believe, sitting with the foundation paperwork on Thursday evenings, is that the outcomes in this story weren't random. They followed from choices made consistently over a very long time. My father chose to direct his resources toward people who needed them, rather than toward a lifestyle that would have impressed no one who mattered. He chose discipline over comfort, structure over convenience, privacy over recognition. Those choices compounded, the way money compounds when you leave it alone, the way character compounds when you keep showing up to it, until they became something none of us had expected to find. And Colin's choices compounded too, in the other direction, until the gap between what he wanted and what he'd built became something he had to face in a mediator's office in downtown Toronto. That's not a moral judgment, it's just how it works. The way we spend our attention and our decisions eventually becomes the life we're living, whether we planned it or not. What I try to carry from this, what I hope the foundation carries forward, is the understanding that real integrity doesn't require an audience. My father never asked anyone to notice him, he just kept doing the work. He kept showing up to Vancouver in October. He kept the distributions running. He built something durable out of consistency and clear thinking and a refusal to let comfort become the whole point. That combination, knowing what's right, thinking carefully about how to do it, and doing it anyway even when it's inconvenient, is the only thing I've seen actually last. Colin sent his monthly update on the 15th, same as always. He's paying things down. He's talking to his advisor. He wrote at the bottom of a very ordinary message, "I think I finally understand what he meant about bridges." I saved that. I read it again a few days later. My father built bridges, quietly in October in Vancouver, with no one watching. And when I finally found them, I understood that he'd been building one for me too. Not out of money, but out of example. The kind you either choose to follow or you don't. I'm choosing to follow it.